If you've tried to buy a car since 2020, you've likely experienced some shock when you saw the price.
And anyone who has been grocery shopping in the past 2 years will also have encountered bare shelves, fewer options, and price surges. So what on earth is going on?
My name is Mariano Spector.
And I'm Jing Zhou. We are IMF economists who focus on Europe, and we wanted to understand what was behind this, from factory floors to store shelves.
We know that the supply chain has been heavily disrupted by the pandemic. We've seen the headlines. People trying to buy things like furniture or cars, but finding themselves waiting weeks or even months. It's hurting growth, and it's a huge drag on the recovery. It's also pushing prices up everywhere. Let's start by considering what's causing the bottlenecks. The pandemic has created a shock to both the supply and the demand for goods at the same time. On the demand side, pandemic containment measures have prevented people from going out to spend money on services, like dining or entertainment. So instead, they have been spending more on goods that they can use at home. Furthermore, government support has protected households from income loss, safeguarding consumption. This greater demand for goods has outstripped production capacity and put pressures on global logistic networks, jamming ports and pushing up costs.
At the same time, the pandemic has severely disrupted supply. For example, factories had to shut down during lockdowns, and workers needed to stay home when they got sick. This has dragged on the supply side of the economy and created bottlenecks all the way down the supply chain. So those hard prices, if factories in Asia cannot produce and ship out parts such as microchips, then factories in Europe cannot assemble their cars. And so automobiles become more scarce and consumers end up paying more.
So how much have these supply shocks affected production? To try to disentangle the roles of supply and demand, the basic idea is to use two variables: producer price inflation and manufacturing output. Demand shocks lead to higher production and inflation, while supply shocks impair production while driving up inflation.
We look at the data for the last 20 years in Europe and beyond. What we saw was that if there had been no supply shocks, then manufacturing output would have been about 7.5% higher in the euro area in the second half of last year. And the increase in producer prices would have been about 5.5 percentage points lower.
So, which countries are most vulnerable to supply bottlenecks? The extent of supply disruption has been diverse. For instance, manufacturing production weakened during much of 2021 in Germany, while continuing to recover in the United Kingdom. So we wanted to find out what factors make a country more vulnerable to supply shocks.
After comparing country economic profiles, a pattern of 3 characteristics began to emerge to show us which countries are most vulnerable to supply chain risks. The first is the share of the economy made up by the auto sector. Cars are vastly complex products, requiring a lot of differentiated inputs that are hard to find alternative suppliers for in a short amount of time. A prime example is the customized microchips that go into each automobile.
The second is the share of foreign resources used in domestic output. When your own factories depend on foreign products, supply shocks abroad can spill into your country.
The third is the position of the country in global value chains. Countries producing raw materials such as oil or metal used at the initial stage of production are less vulnerable. Those at the downstream experience accumulated shocks from their suppliers.
So how long will the bottlenecks last? We find that up to 40% of the supply shocks can be traced to shutdowns, which should have only transient effects on supply and inflation. Other drivers, such as labor shortages and aging logistics infrastructure, could be more persistent. With the Omicron wave and the war in Ukraine, supply disruptions could last for longer than industry experts' previous expectations, possibly into 2023. This outlook is very uncertain.
So, how can policymakers help? They can loosen supply bottlenecks by streamlining regulatory measures wherever possible. For instance, by fast-tracking the licensing of transport workers and easing immigration rules.
Second, to avoid long-term damage to economic growth from prolonged bottlenecks, policymakers can ensure that viable jobs are protected, for instance, using short-time work schemes. Equally vital is that they support labor supply recovery by training newly needed skills and ensuring strong child and elder care, so people can return to work.
Lastly, central banks need to strike a balance between supporting the recovery and preventing prices and wages from spiraling upwards.
It's critical that they continue to communicate how they will react to inflation and inflation expectations, and signal readiness to respond rapidly to significant changes in the medium-term inflation outlook.
Altogether, they can loosen the bottlenecks that have been strangling supplies and pressing prices ever higher.